The rain had not stopped for 7 days when the body surfaced on the edge of Blackwater Marsh. It lay tangled among reeds and drifting branches, its pale skin marked by something darker than decay. Sheriff Elias Moore had seen death before, but something about the stillness of the marsh felt unnatural, as if the water itself was holding its breath. The air carried the smell of stagnant mud mixed with sharp, metallic tang, and the ripples across the surface moved against the wind. The town of Blackwater, tucked deep in the pine-choked lowlands of South Carolina, was a place that seemed to exist outside of time. The narrow streets were lined with shuttered windows and peeling paint, and the people who stayed rarely welcomed strangers. Outsiders were tolerated but never trusted, and once the sun dipped below the tree-line, the silence could make even the bravest uneasy. The marsh was its heart and curse, a sprawl of black water, rotting cypress, and half-drowned pathways that locals avoided at night. Rumors about the marsh went back generations. Some swore it swallowed men whole without leaving a trace. Others whispered of lights drifting just above the water, and shadows moving where nothing should be. The old records, locked away in the county archives, spoke of disappearances, of men found days later without a single mark on them, yet their eyes clouded in horror. The body pulled from the marsh belonged to Matthew Kerrigan, a young man known in town for his restless nature. He had vanished 3 weeks earlier after telling friends he was going to hunt along the northern edge of the marsh, a stretch locals called Devil's Spine. The search for him had turned up nothing until the storms came, churning the water and revealing what lay beneath. His face was twisted, lips drawn back in a silent scream, and his hands were curled into claws as if he tried to hold on to something that slipped away. Moore ordered the body covered and sent to coroner, but the moment the sheet touched Kerrigan's skin, the air seemed to shift. A low hum passed through the marsh, faint enough that only those standing closest noticed. One deputy crossed himself, muttering under his breath. Moore told himself it was the wind. The coroner's report was no help. No signs of trauma, no drowning, no natural cause of death. Kerrigan's organs were intact, yet his blood contained traces of a substance no lab could identify, thick, dark, and almost resinous. Samples sent to the state lab returned inconclusive results, along with quiet notes suggesting contamination. As the rain kept falling, more strange occurrences unfolded. Tracks appeared along the northern bank of the marsh, barefoot, human-sized, yet with an unnatural spread to the toes, pressed deep into the mud, as if by something far heavier than a man. Locals began finding dead fish along the shoreline, their bodies intact, but their eyes missing. A thick mist began to roll in every night, thicker than any fog the town had seen before, curling low and swallowing the roads in silence. Moore began reviewing old case files, searching for patterns. What he found unsettled him. Every 23 years, during a cycle of heavy rains, someone vanished in or near the marsh. Their bodies, if recovered at all, bore the same features. No injuries, no clear cause, the same resinous substance in their blood. In each case, the disappearance was preceded by reports of strange lights over Devil's Spine and whispers in the night. The sheriff knew he was drifting into territory that law enforcement training could not explain. Still, his gut told him these were not random tragedies. Something in the marsh was active again. The turning point came when a farmer named Harold Bennett failed to return from checking his traps near Devil's Spine. His boat was found adrift, tied loosely to a rotting post. Inside lay a shotgun unfired and a lantern still burning. Bennett's footprints led down to the water's edge, but there were no tracks coming back. The ground was disturbed, as if something heavy had been dragged into the marsh, but there was no blood, no torn clothing, no sign of struggle, only the faint impression of a second set of prints, larger and deeper than his own. Moore ventured out with 2 deputies the next morning, following the shoreline toward Devil's Spine. The mist clung to their boots, and the air grew colder with each step. The reeds swayed though there was no wind, and now and then a ripple moved across the surface of the water, circling them as if unseen eyes watched from beneath. The deputies whispered that the marsh was breathing. Moore didn't disagree. They reached the spine just before noon. It was a narrow stretch where the land rose slightly above the water, littered with the bleached remains of cypress stumps. The mud here was black and slick, smelling faintly of sulfur. At the center lay a hollow depression filled with water, so dark it reflected nothing at all, not even the pale sky. Something about it made Moore's skin tighten. He noticed movement below the surface, slow and deliberate, like the shifting of enormous limbs. The water pulsed once, faintly, sending ripples outward. Then came the sound, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to bypass the ears and settled directly into the bones. One deputy clutched his head, swearing he felt pressure behind his eyes. When they retreated, Moore glanced back and thought he saw a pale shape break the surface, long-fingered and eyeless, before sinking again. That night, Sheriff Moore barely slept. The sound from the marsh still reverberated in his chest, a low vibration that refused to fade. It was not simply memory. At times, it felt like the echo grew stronger in the quiet, as though the marsh was calling him back. He poured himself another coffee and studied the coroner's photos of Kerrigan's body, tracing the faint discoloration along the veins in his arms. Under fluorescent light, the marks looked almost like branching roots. Reports from residents began to stack on his desk. Animals missing from farms, lanterns flickering without wind, a fisherman claiming he saw something rise beneath his boat, forcing him to cut his line and row for shore. In each account, the location was the same, the northern reach of Blackwater Marsh. Moore pulled a faded leather ledger from the archives, a century-old record kept by the first sheriff of Blackwater County. The handwriting was cramped, ink bleeding into the yellowed paper, but the entries told a pattern. In 1874, a logging crew disappeared. In 1897, a preacher vanished during a baptism ceremony at the Spine. In 1920, 3 children were found wandering near the marsh. Unable to speak, their eyes blackened as though burned. Every generation, the marsh claimed someone or several, and always during storms heavy enough to swell its waters. The ledger ended abruptly after a final note in 1920. The water rises. The lights return. We cannot close it. Only wait. 2 days later, the sheriff returned to Devil's Spine with a camera, a lantern, and a length of rope tied around his waist. He told no one. The mist was thicker than before, curling in tendrils that seemed to follow him. The air was heavy, each breath tasting faintly metallic. As he approached the depression at the center of the spine, the surface of the black water was motionless, unnervingly still. He set the lantern down and aimed the camera toward the center. At first, nothing, then a flicker, a light moving beneath the surface, like a lantern drifting deep underwater. The glow grew stronger, rising toward him, until it became clear it was not light at all, but a shape that reflected none of the lantern's glow. The surface broke without sound, and for a moment he could see it. Pale skin stretched tight over something too long to be human, fingers that trailed and defined, hair-like tendrils, a mouth that did not open but pulsed faintly as if drawing breath through the water itself. The thing sank without ripple, leaving only the thrum, louder now, pressing against his skull. Moore stumbled backward, nearly falling, the rope around his waist tightening as if something below had tugged it. He cut the line with his knife and retreated, leaving the lantern behind. Back in town, the photographs revealed nothing but darkness and mist. Yet the sheriff knew what he had seen, and he knew it was not something the law could handle. That night, the water in the marsh rose further, swallowing part of the road that led to the Bennett farm. Locals spoke of hearing footsteps outside their windows in the early hours, slow and deliberate, though no prints were found in the mud. The schoolteacher reported a group of children staring out the window during lessons, their eyes fixed on something in the tree line. When asked what they saw, they only shook their heads. Moore began to dream of the marsh. In the dreams, he stood on the spine as the water spread endlessly in all directions, swallowing the pines, the town, everything. Shapes moved just beneath the surface, circling, their eyeless faces always turning toward him. He would wake with the taste of brackish water in his mouth. The storm showed no sign of ending. More homes along the marsh's edge began to flood, and families moved inland, leaving their houses dark and empty. But not all left. Some stayed, drawn by something they could not explain. Moore found Harold Bennett's wife standing ankle-deep in the water one morning, staring toward the marsh as if waiting for someone. When he called to her, she did not move, her eyes glazed. Only when he touched her shoulder did she blink and seemed awake, confused at where she was. By the fourth week of rain, another body surfaced, a woman this time, unknown to anyone in Blackwater. She had no identification, no sign of struggle, and the same resinous substance in her veins. Her skin bore faint, symmetrical marks along her ribs, like something had pressed against her from the inside. Moore knew the cycle was accelerating. The ledger's warnings were no longer just history. They were happening now. Something beneath the marsh had been waiting for storms, and now it was feeding. He began to suspect that the water itself was not just a place, but a threshold, and whatever was on the other side was pushing through. The storms broke records that month, drowning the lowlands in a constant sheet of gray. Roads dissolved into muck. The river swelled over its banks, and the marsh expanded like an organism reclaiming old territory. From the watchtower near the town's edge, Sheriff Moore could see entire stands of cypress vanish beneath the dark water. The changes in the marsh were no longer subtle. Cypress stumps that had been fixed in place for decades now shifted position from one day to the next, as though the land beneath them had turned liquid. The water itself carried a sheen under the moonlight, not oil but something thicker, moving in veins and branching patterns like roots beneath the surface. It was during one of these moonlit surveys that Moore noticed lights, dozens of them, drifting low above the water near Devil's Spine. They weren't steady. They pulsed in unison, almost breathing. Every time the lights brightened, he thought he could hear that same deep thrum in his bones. He returned to the ledger, reading the oldest entries again. One in particular stood out. Beneath the spine, the black water hides the first crossing. The rains feed it, and when the roots drink deep, the way opens. It is not ours to command, only to endure. Moore didn't know what the first crossing meant, but the phrasing gave him the same uneasy feeling he'd had staring into that motionless pool weeks earlier. He began to wonder if the marsh wasn't simply killing. It might be a doorway, and every storm was a key turning in the lock. 3 days after the appearance of the strange lights, the first disappearance within town limits occurred. Sarah Whitford, a nurse at the clinic, was last seen walking home after her shift. Her porch light was still on when neighbors checked in the morning, but her door stood open, rain pooling on the floor inside. There was no sign of forced entry. The only tracks in the mud were her own until they reached the sidewalk, where they stopped. That night, the mist rolled deeper into town than ever before. It seeped through the alleys and between houses, muffling sound. Moore patrolled the streets, lantern in hand, the beam barely cutting through the haze. Shapes moved within it, sometimes clearly human, sometimes wrong. At the corner near the abandoned feed store, he saw Sarah. She was standing motionless in the mist, her head tilted toward him. Her skin glistened as though wet, but the rain had stopped hours earlier. When he called her name, she stepped backward into the haze, and the mist closed behind her. By the time he reached the spot, there was nothing, no tracks, no sound. Only the thrum, stronger than it had ever been, vibrating through the ground. In the days that followed, the marsh began to send its presence further inland. Wells turned foul overnight, wooden door frames warped as though swollen from within. Pets went missing, and in the mornings, owners sometimes found strange, with impressions on their porches. Marks that looked like hands, but far too long and thin to belong to a person. Moore's breaking point came when a portion of the highway collapsed into a sinkhole filled with black water. The state sent engineers, but they refused to approach the edge after claiming the ground trembled under their boots. The hole was filled within a week, not with concrete, but with more water from the marsh. The sheriff decided to act. He took a small skiff and rowed into the northern reach, determined to find the hollow pool at Devil's Spine again and see what lay beneath it in full daylight. The air was unervingly still as he pushed through the reeds, the only sound the quiet drip of water from his oars. When he reached the spine, the pool was larger than before, its edges eroded by the constant rain. The water inside was perfectly smooth, as though sealed by a thin layer of glass. He leaned over, peering into the depths. What he saw was not reflection but movement, a slow spiraling of shapes, pale and elongated, their bodies twisting around one another in patterns that seemed deliberate. At the center was something darker, massive, its outline obscured by the swirling forms around it. The thrum now was deafening. though the air was silent. The mass shifted. A single tendril, pale and slick, rose toward the surface. It hovered just beneath the waterline, quivering. Then it touched the underside of the skiff with sound like wet cloth tearing. The wood groaned. Moore backed away, rowing hard, but the water beneath him began to churn. Shapes followed his boat, keeping pace, their bodies coiling upward like vines toward sunlight. He did not stop until he reached the shallows, where the water turned to mud. Even then, the thrum followed him, fading only once the spine was out of sight. That night, the lights returned to the marsh, dozens of them, moving not randomly but in a slow arc toward town. The lights reached the town by the second night. They moved like a silent tide to the mist, low to the ground, pulsing faintly. People locked their doors and drew curtains, but some could not resist looking. Those who stared too long reported a strange sensation afterward, a ringing in their skulls, a pull toward the marsh, dreams filled with dark water. Sheriff Moore doubled the patrols, but it made little difference. The lights slipped through streets and alleys without sound, never touching anything, yet leaving the air damp and cold in their wake. Every so often, one of them would pause outside a house, hovering for several minutes before drifting away. Those homes were always the same ones that later reported missing pets, or missing people. The first direct attack happened just after midnight on Rosewood Lane. A man named William Rourke was found dead on his porch, his skin pale and covered in thin, branching marks like frost. There was no sign of struggle, and his eyes were gone. The coroner's report noted that the substance in his blood was identical to what had been found in Matthew Kerrigan and the unidentified woman. The panic spread fast. Families fled inland, leaving homes dark and streets empty. But not everyone left. Some claimed they couldn't. Moore began noticing familiar faces in the mist each night. People he knew to be alive, walking slowly toward the marsh, their eyes glassy and unblinking. He tried to stop them once, grabbing a teenage boy by the arm, but the boy's skin was ice cold and slick, as though freshly pulled from deep water. The boy turned his head toward the sheriff, not in recognition, but as if acknowledging an obstacle, then stepped back into the haze and was gone. The rain swelled the marsh further, and the boundary between it and the town blurred. Streets near the edge became shallow canals. The water was not like ordinary floodwater. It moved with its own rhythm, pulsing faintly, carrying fragments of reeds and pale shapes just beneath the surface. The smell of sulfur hung over the town. Moore returned to the ledger, desperate for anything that might be a solution. Near the back, he found an entry dated 1794, written by a man named Elias Black, the town's founder. We sealed it once with fire and salt, but the root remains. When the water swells, it seeks to open again. The first crossing was not a beginning, but a breach. Something came through, and the marsh was its anchor. We cannot destroy it. We can only turn it back before the way is wide enough for the body to pass. The words struck him cold. The lights, the thrum, the pale shapes, they were not the body. They were fragments, tendrils. The thing itself was still beneath the spine, waiting for the rains to open the way fully. On the third night after the lights reached town, the breach began. It started with a deep vibration that shook the ground, strong enough to rattle windows. The water in the streets began to move, not from the wind, but as if being pulled toward a single point. That point was Devil's Spine. From every flooded alley and ditch, thin streams of water began to flow in that direction, as though the marsh were drawing itself inward. Moore, standing at the North Road, saw the lights converge there. They circled above the spine, their pulses now rapid, like a heartbeat in panic. The mist thickened until the trees vanished, and from within it came the first sound, the wet tearing he had heard beneath the skiff, now magnified until it felt like the air itself was splitting. Then the water rose, not in waves, but in one immense smooth swell, lifting without spilling, forming a shape that dwarfed the trees. The mist clung to it, but within the shifting gray, Moore saw movement, vast, slow limbs, pale and ridged, fingers ending in tendrils that writhed like searching roots. Something pressed outward against the mist, and where it touched, the fog burned away to reveal skin the color of bone, slick and glistening. The thrum became a roar, not in the air but inside the skull. Moore staggered, clutching his head, but he did not look away. This was the body the ledger had warned about, the thing the marsh had been feeding for centuries. And now it was crossing. From the water around the spine, smaller shapes emerged, humanoid but stretched, their limbs too long, their faces smooth where eyes and mouth should have been. They moved into shallows with slow, deliberate steps, and wherever they touched, the ground darkened and split, seeping more of the black water. Moore knew there was no time left for gradual evacuation. He rang the old steel alarm in the center town, the sound carrying over the rooftops. Those who could still move gathered what they could and fled inland. But the ones who had been touched by the mist, those who had stared into the lights, remained. They walked toward the marsh in silence, their feet leaving no mark on the ground, their skin shining faintly. By dawn, half the town was gone. The spine still pulsed in the distance, but the vast shape had retreated back into the mist, leaving only the tendril creatures at the water's edge. They did not pursue. They waited, Moore realizing that the first crossing was not about a single night. It was a process, and the thing beneath the spine was patient. The day after the breach, the rain stopped. The sudden silence felt wrong, without the constant hiss of water. Every sound carried too far. The groan of shifting wood in abandoned houses, the distant cry of a crow, the faint lapping of water against submerged streets. Sheriff Moore stood on the edge of town, staring toward Devil's Spine. The mist was still there, clinging low over the marsh, but it no longer drifted freely. It sat in place, a dense wall marking the boundary between what was left of Blackwater and the thing that had begun to cross. He kept replaying the words from the ledger. We sealed it once with fire and salt, but the root remains. If the marsh was an anchor for whatever lived beneath it, then the root had to be the connection, the point where it had first entered this world. Destroy that, and maybe the breach could be closed before the way fully opened. The plan was simple, if desperate. He gathered kerosene, a bundle of salt, and the old iron spearhead that had hung in the sheriff's office for over a century. The handle had long since rotted away, but the metal was darkened, pitted, and strangely cold to the touch. An inscription near the base, worn almost smooth, read only, "Turn it back." At dawn, he set out alone. The roads into the marsh were gone, replaced by dark channels of water that led him deeper into the drowned forest. The stillness was absolute. No insects, no birds, only the faint creak of the skiff and the slow swirl of the current beneath him. The deeper he went, the more the water changed. It thickened, clinging to the blades like syrup. Its color shifted from brown to black, and in its surface there was no reflection, only the faint, ghostly glow of shapes moving far below. When the spine came into view, it looked different than before. The hollow pool at its center was wider, its edges crumbling into the black water. The mist above it swirled in a tight spiral, drawn into the center as though the air itself were being pulled downward. Moore stepped onto the spine, the ground soft and cold underfoot. The thrum began immediately, vibrating to the mud, up into his legs, into his chest. He approached the pool and saw that the water no longer hid what was beneath. The root was not a plant, but something far worse. It was a massive, pale coil, slick and ridged like the body of a deep-sea creature, disappearing into the depths on one side and re-emerging on the other. It pulsed faintly, and where its surface broke the water, smaller tendrils reached upward, questing through the air. He poured the salt in a wide circle around the pool, the grains vanishing into mud as though swallowed. Then he doused the ground and the coil's exposed surface with kerosene. The smell was sharp, choking, but he did not hesitate. The moment the match struck, the thrum became a roar. Flames leapt high, but they burned strangely, white at the base, flickering with colors a human eye was never meant to see. The coil convulsed, sending shock waves through the water, and from the mist beyond the spine came a sound that was neither human nor animal, but a vast, wet bellow that shook the trees. Figures emerged from the mist, the eyeless ones, dozens of them. They moved toward the fire without hurry, stepping into the salt circle and recoiling as though struck. The flames hissed higher, licking the air, and the coil writhed violently. Moore drove the iron spearhead into the thickest part of the root. The metal sank deeper than it should have, as if the flesh gave way willingly. For an instant, the thrum stopped. The world held its breath. Then the coil split open, releasing a torrent of black water and a stench of decay so old it made him gag. The mist tore apart as if ripped by wind, and the eyeless ones collapsed into the marsh, their bodies dissolving into pale sludge. The pool began to drain, the water swirling downward into a void that should not have existed. He backed away as the flames consumed what was left of the root. The ground shook once, violently, and then was still. The thrum was gone. By the time he reached the edge of town, the mist had vanished. The water was receding, leaving behind the rotting remains of what the marsh had claimed. The air smelled clean for the first time in months. But as he stood there, watching the last of the black water drain away, Moore saw something half buried in the mud near the shoreline, a fragment of pale, ridged flesh no larger than his hand. It pulsed once, faintly, as though breathing. He did not touch it. 3 months after the fire at Devil's Spine, Blackwater looked almost normal again. The rains had ended, the roads had been rebuilt, and the marsh had retreated to its old boundaries. The state sent aid, repairs were made, and most of the houses once drowned in water now stood dry under the summer sun. But the population was smaller. Many had left and never returned. Others were simply gone, swallowed during the months of mist, their names added to a quiet list that Sheriff Moore kept in his desk. No official report could explain their disappearances. The state's version of events spoke of a freak flooding event and environmental collapse. Moore didn't correct them. The pool at Devil's Spine no longer existed. Where it had been was only cracked mud, bleached by the sun. No mist, no thrum, no sign of the pale coil. But Moore still avoided the place. Even from a distance, he swore the ground there looked different, looser, as if it were only pretending to be solid. The town moved on in cautious denial. People reopened shops. Children returned to school, and fishermen went back to the safer parts of the marsh. But the nights were quieter than before. No one lingered outside after dark, and everyone avoided looking too long toward the northern edge, where the trees still grew thicker and the air carried a faint tang of sulfur after rain. Moore found himself changed in ways he couldn't name. He no longer dreamed of the marsh, but sometimes, while shaving in the morning, he would catch himself humming a low, rhythmic note without realizing it. On certain nights, when the wind was still, he thought he felt the faintest vibration under the floorboards. Too light to be sure, yet enough to make him stop and listen. One evening, while walking the road out toward the Bennett farm, he saw something pale half hidden among the reeds at the water's edge. It was small, no larger than his palm, but its surface was ridged and it pulsed faintly. He didn't touch it, just as before. The next day, it was gone. A year later, during the first big storm of the season, Moore stood at his office window, watching the rain carve silver lines across Main Street. The marsh was out of sight, hidden by the low clouds, but he didn't need to see it. He felt it, distant but alive, as though it were breathing again after a long sleep. He remembered the founder's words, "We can only turn it back before the way is wide enough for the body to pass." It occurred to him that maybe the breach had never fully closed. Maybe the fire and salt had only wounded it, forcing it deeper for a while. And if the cycle was tied to the rains, then another season, another storm would bring it back. That night, as he locked up the office, a flash of light caught his eye down at the far end of Main Street. At first, he thought it was a reflection from the storm, but it was too low, too steady, hovering just above the ground, pulsing faintly in the rain. Moore watched it for a long time, the cold tightening in his chest. Then the light faded into the dark. He did not follow.